大家好，讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續同大家分享 Michael Lewis 嘅 Liar's Poker 讀到第4節啦。咁上一回呢講咗呢個主角啦 Michael Lewis，咁入咗呢個 Salomon Brothers 之後，第一日返工同埋佢初期返工嘅一啲感受啦，一啲見聞啦，係一個非常之混亂，好多男性荷爾蒙接近瘋狂嘅賭博氛圍啦，亦都係正中咗 Michael Lewis 佢自己嘅內心啦，將佢洗腦啦，可以咁講啦嚇，令到佢認為咧 Wall Street 咧應該就係一個咁樣嘅面貌。雖然佢自己咧唔算係嗰啲 back row 嘅，坐喺 back row 喺度叫囂嘅人。佢比較接近坐喺 front row 嗰啲乖乖仔，但係其實佢做出嚟就係 front row 嚇，但係內心咧就係 back row 個咁樣嘅情況，亦都叫做解釋咗公司嘅一個結構啦，一啲唔同嘅人物性格啦，咩人造就咗咩崗位啦咁樣。好，我哋而家睇下第4節嘅情況。Chapter 4 Adult Education. 4 weeks had passed.The class had acquired a sense of its rights. The first inalienable right of a trainee was to dawdle and amuse himself before he settled into his chair for the morning. Cafeteria bagels and coffee were munched and swallowed throughout the room. People read the New York Post and laid bets on whatever game was to be played that evening. The New York Times crossword puzzle had been photocopied 126 times and distributed.Someone had telephoned one of New York's sleazy porno recordings and linked the receiver to a loudspeaker on a table in the front of the classroom. Sex talk filled the air. I was, as was my habit at this hour, biting into a niche. A pal, Max Johnson, former U.S. Navy fighter pilot, nailed Leonard Bublik, four-eyed MBA from the University of Indiana, on the side of the head with a paper wad. Bublik could not have been surprised since this sort of thing happened often. Nevertheless, he looked wounded and sought to identify the offender. "Nice haircut, Bublik," shouted a back row person with his feet up on a chair next to Johnson. "Ooh, grow up, you guys," said Bublik from his seat in the front. Susan James walked in to interrupt the revenge of the nerds too. James played a strange role. She was something between a babysitter and an organizer of the program.Her reward for a job well done was, perversely, to be admitted to a future training program. Like everyone else, she wanted to work on a trading floor. Only she was one step farther removed than we were from realizing that ambition. Her distance from the money-making machine reduced her credibility as a disciplinarian to zero. She had only the power to tattle on us, and really not even that. Because we were her future bosses, she wanted to be our friend.Once we had moved to the trading floor and she to the training program, she would be pleading with us for a job. Trainees knew she had about as much clout as a substitute teacher, and so, when not abusing her, they ignored her. Now, however, she had an important message to deliver. "Quit fooling around, you guys," she pleaded, like a camp counselor before Parents' Day. "Jim Massey is going to be in here in a minute. This class already has a bad enough reputation."Which was true a couple of days before. A back row person had been with the paper wad managing director from Bond Market Research, who had turned the color of raspberry sorbet and screamed for 5 minutes. He hadn't been able to identify the culprit and, before leaving, had promised to have his revenge on us all. Susan James repeated for what must have been the 10th time that the impression formed of us by Jim Massey during his half-hour appearance would affect our careers until we retired or died. Massey, we all thought, was John Goodfriend's hatchetman, an American corporate odd job. It didn't require a triple jump of the imagination to picture him decapitating insolent trainees with a razor-edged bowler head. He had what some people might consider an image problem. He never smiled.His formal position was member of the Salomon Brothers Executive Committee in charge of sales. He was also in charge of our futures. He presided over the job placement blackboard beside the trading floor. A flick of his wrist could send your name flying from New York to Atlanta. Trainees feared Massey. He seemed to prefer it that way. Ostensibly, Massey had come to answer questions we might hear about the firm. We were only a few weeks into the program.Surely, we must have questions about the firm. Actually, we weren't given much choice. We had damn well better be curious, said Susan. and you guys had better ask some good questions. Remember, opinions are being formed. Thus, the bugle was sounded before the chairman's keeper of the corporate culture arrived to answer our questions. He had a jawline lean and sharp enough to cut cake in short crap hair. He wore a grey suit with, unlike other board members, no pocket hanky. He had an economy of style and, like a gifted athlete, an economy of movement, as if he were conserving his energy for a meaningful explosion. He gave a short talk, the point of which was to stress how singular and laudable was the culture of Salomon Brothers. Yes, we knew it was the best trading firm in the world. Yes, we also knew that Salomon stressed teamwork. Yes, we realized that the quickest way to be fired was to appear in the press boasting about how much money we made. Perhaps we had heard the fate of the Salomon man in Los Angeles who appeared in Newsweek lounging beside a swimming pool and boasting about his good fortune. Yes, he had been sacked. Yes, we knew Salomon's $3 billion in capital made it the most powerful force in the financial markets. Yes, we knew that no matter what we had achieved in our small lives, we weren't fit to get a cup of coffee from the men in the trading floor. Yes, we knew not to concern ourselves too much, but rather let the firm decide where on the trading floor we should be placed at the end of the training program. Like the other Salomon executives, Messi was flying high in 1985 on the back of a series of record-earning quarters. These were not merely records for Salomon Brothers, but records for all of Wall Street. He could do no wrong. From his description, the firm could do no wrong. Yet when he called for questions, there was silence. We were too frightened to talk. I certainly wasn't going to say anything. No doubt he knew many things I should like to have known, but I sensed that his call for questions was not genuine. In this, I wasn't alone. No one dared ask, for example, why, at the same time everyone else at Salomon was being told not to talk to the press, Goodfriend had his Chuberic face plastered on the cover of every business magazine in the country. Nor was anyone going to ask what we really wanted to know, how much money we could make over the next few years. And the most obvious question no one asked was why Jim Messi, the man in charge of hiring trainees, the man directly responsible for the explosive growth of the firm, was not worried that the firm was expanding recklessly. No, we were stumped for questions to ask. This, I made a note at the time, is what distinguishes work from school. Curious minds were not what Messi was after. Messi was looking for cult followers, but he repulsed the most slobbering front row people. Even they were reluctant to cater to such an obvious desire. Beside me in the front sat Susan James, looking like a frustrated babysitter. Come on, you guys, ask questions. At last, to my right, the hand of an egregious front row person rose. I saw who it was and shut my eyes, waiting to be embarrassed for him. He did not disappoint. Could you tell us, said the young fortune seeker, whether the firm has considered opening an office in an Eastern European country? You know, like Prague. Like Prague. Had the speaker been anyone beneath the level executive committee member, the room would have erupted in spitballs, paperweights, and howling. As it was, unnatural sounds came from the back row, as if a dozen young men were choking back their ridicule. The thought of Salomon Brothers in Prague had possibly never occurred to anyone in the 75 years history of the firm. Such is the spark of creativity generated by the presence of a member of the executive committee demanding to be asked questions. Yet Messi took the question straight, like a State Department spokesman. He plainly would have preferred to be asked, to what do you attribute your success at Salomon? But today, he must have thought, just wasn't his day. After Messi left, it was a month before anyone of his level in the company ventured into the training program. Perhaps he let them know that we weren't very good at this game. But then suddenly, in rapid succession, we enjoyed visits from another executive committee member, Dale Horowitz, and then the chairman himself. Horowitz was an old world investment banker in his middle 50s, a street-smart relationship man, a natural candidate to open and run the Prague office when the time came. His head bobbed on top of his big body, and his face always reminded me of Yogi Bear. All I knew about him when he arrived was that he, like Goodfriend, had made his name in municipal bonds, and that a few of my Jewish friends were devoted to him. He was the original rabbi, kind and wise, with a taste for large cigars. People called him Uncle Dale. He declined to stand at the podium and instead sat down at the table in the front of the room and spread his arms wide. He talked about how much more important it was to have a family than to have a career, which I think impressed most people at the strangest thing they had heard in the course of the training program. Then he said in his deep, warm voice, he would answer any questions we cared to ask. Really, go on and ask. anything. Several hands rose. I thought this was going to be the long-awaited everything you wanted to know about Solomon, but were afraid to ask session. From somewhere in the middle of the room came the first good question all day. Why, asked the trainee, is Solomon blacklisted by the Arabs? Uncle Dale's face wrinkled. What do you want to know about that for? He snapped. He looked pissed off, like an angry yogi. The Arab blacklist was an unmentionable, although I can't imagine why. You didn't have to be Dick Tracy to discover we were on it. The Arabs had severed relations with Solomon when it had merged with the commodity traders Phillips Brothers. Phillips Brothers, I was told, had ties to Israel. I thought the blacklist would have lost its sting with the collapse of the price of oil. The Arabs were now spending more than they were earning. At $12 a barrel, they were far less important as clients than they had once been. No corporate secrets here. Still, you could almost see the black mark being registered against the name of the man who had asked the question. The children had ceased to amuse Uncle. We had been lulled into a false sense of security. We sensed this all at once. Hands vanished around the room, yanked from the maws of a closing trap. But one poor guy was slow to catch on. Horowitz called on him. Why, asked the trainee, do we tolerate a South African company as our largest shareholder? Does anyone in the firm consider the ethics of our owners? Horowitz shot him this killer look that said, You trainees are too impudent for words. By this time, he was rolling a big fat cigar round his mouth, and his eyes had narrowed to pillbox slits. A South African mining company called Minorco owned 12% of Solomon Incorporation. Uncle Dale's answer was that, yes, ethics was a consideration, but that beyond that, he wasn't going to discuss the issue. So much for Glasnost. A few mornings later, John Goodfriend arrived. By this time, we had grown weary of heart-to-heart chats with senior management. A few trainees planned to sleep in on the morning of Goodfriend's talk. Susan James worried she wouldn't produce enough of a crowd for the great man. She had secretaries call us in our homes in the wee hours of the morning before the event to threaten us with punishment if we didn't show up. Her effort was wasted on me. I had no intention of missing it, just as if Joan Collins had come to speak. I wouldn't miss her. I hardly expected to hear anything new, but I thought I might learn something indirectly. For here was a man who was said to have stamped his personality onto an institution. His faults as well as virtues were those of Solomon Brothers. Goodfriend is often accused of affecting a British accent, but at this point in his career, he limited himself to calling other men fellows. As in, Jim Massey is a very talented fellow. Even that, as far as I can determine, is not a British affectation, but a northeastern American one. No, his only noticeable affectation was a statesman-like calmness. He was so intensely calm and deliberate that he made you nervous and suspicious. He paused interminably after each question we asked him. He really seemed to want to know what we were thinking. When a trainee asked him about Solomon Brothers' policy towards charity, Goodfriend, with furrowed brow, after standing silent for an uncomfortably long time, said that charity was a very difficult issue. He would appreciate our input. The statement's veneer was a pleasant departure from the gruff, foul-mouthed trader that people expected John Goodfriend to be. And he not only sounded the part, but looked the part. He was round like Churchill, with the thinning white hair of Harry Truman, and the grandeur, if not the height, of de Gaulle. But what had become of the man who claimed to stand ready each morning to bite the off a bear? Where was the man who was known round Wall Street for his brutal power plays? The man whose very name struck terror in the hearts of managing directors? We didn't know, and I'm not sure we wanted to find out. The problem with his lofty sentiments and pregnant pauses was that they were completely eclipsed by his reputation. Because of what we had heard about him, it was impossible to imagine discussing the United Way with him over tea in his office. Who knew where he had picked up the wise statesman's routine? But no one thought it was real, just dangerous, like the mesmeric gaze of a cobra. After telling us nothing much, but showing us what a world-class financial celebrity looked like up close, he left. And that was the end of our exposure to the management of Solomon Brothers. I assumed the strange behavior of our managers was simply a response to having had a pile of loot drop into their laps. They were still enjoying the turkey stuffed by Paul Volcker and America's borrowing spree. There they were, modest men, living off other people's scraps, when all of a sudden the big fat stuffed bird was handed to them. They were doing nothing more than what they had always done, yet overnight glory was thrust upon them. Their incomes had changed, and with it their lives, imagine. If you are a self-possessed man with a healthy sense of detachment from your bank account and someone writes you a check for tens of millions of dollars, you probably behave as if you have won a sweepstakes, kicking your feet in the air and laughing yourself to sleep at night at the miracle of your good fortune. But if your sense of self-worth is morbidly wrapped up in your financial success, you probably believe you deserve everything you get. You take it as a reflection of something grand inside you. You acquire gravitas and project it like a cologne whenever you discuss the singular and laudable Salomon Brothers culture. Almost everyone on Wall Street took his money seriously, regardless of its origin, and our bosses were no exception. But a few of the old hands within Salomon Brothers suffered a more complicated response to their money. Not that they ever doubted they were worth every penny they got, but they were uneasy with the explosion of debt in America. The head of bond research at Salomon, Henry Kaufman, was, when I arrived, a most acute case of cognitive dissonance. He was the guru of the bond market and also the conscience of our firm. He told investors whether their fast-moving bonds were going up or down. He was so often right that the market made him famous, if not throughout the English-speaking world, then at least among the sort of people who read the Wall Street Journal. Yet Kaufman was known as Dr. Gloom. The party had been thrown in his honor, but he seemed to want it to end. As he wrote in the Institutional Investor of July 1987, one of the most remarkable things that happened in the 1980s was sharp explosion in debt, way beyond any historical benchmark. It was way beyond anything you would have expected relative to GNP, relative to monetary expansion that was taking place. But it came about, I think, as a result of freeing the financial system, putting into being financial entrepreneurship and not putting into being adequate disciplines and safeguards. So that's where we are. That is where we are, wild, reckless, and deeply in hock. We at Salomon Brothers were among the heading financial entrepreneurs. What Kaufman was saying is that we had helped create the problem. While most of America imagined that Wall Street meant the stock market, our bond market was setting the tone and the pace on Wall Street in the 1980s. Salomon Brothers was at the crossroads of change, gorging itself on the windfall from being at the right place at the right time, priding itself justifiably on its superior bond trading skills, but all the time wearing a blindfold. It lacked an accurate vision of where this explosion in the bond market would lead. There was no shortage of opinions on what to do with the windfall gains. A trader always has a view, but the opinions were both arbitrary and self-indulgent. And Salomon Brothers, from 1980 onward, took what must be one of the most expensive and fanciful commercial rides in the history of the American corporation. For most of that ride, it patted itself on the back. With nearly 8 weeks of education behind us, the faces of speakers were beginning to blend together. Yet another trader with a Brooklyn accent and a hacking cough plunked down in front and lectured between drags on a cancer stick. Still, something distinguished him from other speakers. Exactly what it was eluded me at first. Then I realized. Wrinkles. This man was old. His attitude toward his job was, by our standards, sentimental. He released his epigrams like pet dogs. When I'm trading, you see, I don't stop to pat myself on the back, because when I pat myself on the back, the next sensation is usually a sharp kick lower down, and it isn't so pleasant. When asked the key to his success, he said, "In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Best of all, he gave us a rule of thumb about information in the market that I later found useful. Those who say don't know, and those who know don't say. He was speaking of the stock market. He belonged to the dreaded equity department, the sleepy backwater in which lurked such career stoppers as equities in Dallas. The cheapest way to avoid being airmailed to Dallas to paddle stocks was never to meet anyone in the equity department. It first had to pick you out of a lineup before it could employ you. You sank low in our seats during the week that the people from the equity department spoke. We assumed we'd never have to see them again once they had left the training program. That is not to say they were inept. Salomon Brothers was the leading underwriter of new stock issues on Wall Street and one of the 2 or 3 top equity traders. But inside Salomon Brothers, the men from equities were second-class citizens. Equities, comparatively speaking, made no money. The equity department wasn't on 41st, the principal trading floor, but on the floor below. The 40th floor had low ceilings, no windows, and the charm of an engine room. Besides the equity traders, it warehoused a large number of Salomon bond salesmen. The sound of 40 as perpetual as crickets in the woods at night, was the atonal strain of stocks and bonds being sold, the pleading tone in 100 voices, and the rusting of facts being repackaged to look better than when they arrived. Through the loudspeaker, known as the hoot and holler, a man on 41st hooted and hollered at the salesman on 40th to sell more bonds. I once walked through when the firm was attempting to sell the bonds of the drugstore chain Refco. The voice boomed out of the box. "Come on, people, we're not selling truth." Life on the 40th floor was grim. The 40th floor was more remote from the all-powerful 41st than more geography can suggest. A separate bank of elevators serviced 40. People conversed all day between 40 and 41st, yet never laid eyes on each other. Communication systems were sufficiently advanced and human relations sufficiently primitive that a salesman in Dallas felt just as close to the 41st floor as did a salesman on the 40th floor. The salesman in Dallas was in some ways closer to Power Central, at least when he paid homage on 41st because he had come from a distance. The managing director said hello to him. The equity department was an object lesson in life's reversals. The stock market had once been Wall Street's greatest source of revenues. Commissions were fat, fixed, and non-negotiable. Each time a share changed hands, some broker somewhere took out a handsome fee for himself, without necessarily doing much work. A broker was paid twice as much for executing a 200-share order as for a 100-share order, even though the amount of work in either case was the same. The end of fixed stock brokerage commissions had come on May 1st, 1975, called May Day by stockbrokers, after which, predictably, commissions collapsed. Investors switched to whichever stockbroker charged them the least. As a result, in 1976, revenues across Wall Street fell by some $600 million. The dependable money machine broke down. Then, to add insult to penury, the bond market exploded. With the rise of the bond markets, the equity salesmen and traders had been reduced by comparison to small-time toll takers. They made a bit of money and had a few laughs, but not nearly so many as the bondmen. No equity trader, for example, would dream of playing liar's poker for $1 million. Where would he get the money? We trainees weren't into being poor. This presented the equity desk people with the problem of how to persuade us to join them. When they came through the training program, far from presenting their posteriors for our immediate attention, as did many of the bondmen, the equity department speakers delivered one long, uninterrupted sales pitch. Their speeches had a pitiful, pleading quality about them, exacerbating the problem. We trainees might have been slow in many ways, but we had a nose for fashion. We knew that in general the quality of treatment we received in the training class varied inversely with the desirability of the job held by the speaker. In this, there was a lesson. To get the best job, you had to weather the most abuse. For that matter, being a trainee wasn't so different from being a customer. Just as the equity people had to flatter and indulge us, they had to flatter and indulge the customers to win business, because the equity market was brutally competitive. An investor could buy shares in IBM from Salomon, but he could equally well buy them from 40 over stockbrokers. Bond people, on the other hand, could kick us and beat us trainees with impunity, as they could also, if they wanted, kick and beat the customers, because Salomon was nearly a monopolist in certain bond markets. From the way we were treated, we were able to infer both the standards of behavior in every market and the degree of dominance Salomon enjoyed. Though perhaps not articulated by every trainee, the ultimate message was lost on no one. Join equities and kiss like Willie Loman. Join bonds and kick like Rambo. Still, the people in the equity department seemed happy, though not until I spent some time with them did I begin to fathom why. They felt less pressure than bond traders and bond salesmen. They had accepted their lot and, like the peasants in the Bruegel pastoral scene, were content to celebrate the simple pleasures of life. A house on the Jersey Shore rather than in the Hamptons. Skiing in Vermont rather than Sumat. And hard as it was for me to appreciate, the people in the equity department were having careers. They had seen bull markets, bear markets, and dull markets. As long as they had their beloved stock, they seemed not to mind their relative penury. They desperately wanted to convey to us the soulfulness of their jobs. To this end, they distributed a book of poems, essays, and quotations at the outset of their training program module. It opened, unfortunately, with the following passage written by an equity man, entitled Memoirs of a Trader. The market, he had learned, was like the sea, to be respected and feared. You sail on its smooth surface on a placid midsummer day. You were borne along by a favoring breeze, took a pleasant swim in its waters, and basked in the rays of the sun. Or you lolled in the quiet currents and dozed. A cold gust of wind brought you to sharply, clouds gathered. The sun had gone. There were flashes of lightning and peals of thunder. The ocean was whipped into seething waves. Your fragile craft was tossed about by heavy seas that broke over its sides. Half the crew was swept overboard. You were washed upon the shore. Naked and exhausted, you sank upon the beach, thankful for life itself. The equity department weathered not only rough seas, but rejection as well. It hurt to watch. Every day the MC of the equity module, Laudable, made a valiant and often brilliant pitch to sway us. Yet each day he failed. The gist of Laszlo's pitch for the equity department was this question. When you turn on your television at 6:30 and Dan Rather tells you that today the market went up 24 points, what market do you think he means? What? Laszlo would say. You think he's talking about grade A industrial bonds? Ha! He's talking about the stock market. In other words, if you joined the equity department, your mother would know what you did for a living. Laszlo also stressed the stock market's long history and culture. Everyone from Will Rogers to John Kenneth Galbraith had held forth on the stock market. In joining equities, we could be a part of something far larger than ourselves. I'm not sure we could conceive of anything much larger than ourselves, and even if we had, it would not have been the stock market. As a result, this particular appeal by Laszlo never worked. We were unmoved by history and culture. In any way, the wise men invariably made the stock market seem an unappealing place to work. Their scribblings were as smarmy as Memoirs of a Trader, as in the case of this quotation from someone named Walter Goodman. There is nothing like the ticker tape except a woman. Nothing that promises, hour after hour, day after day, such sudden developments. Nothing that disappoints so often or that occasionally fulfills with such unbelievable, passionate magnificence. To which male trainees, who recalled only their sexual conquests, rolled their eyes into the backs of their heads and blushed. Who knows what the female trainees thought? Deep down, however, the stock market people didn't care much for book learning or school or anything except raw experience. Quotes from stock market legend Benjamin Graham were wheeled in to defend their position. In the stock market, the more elaborate and abstruse the mathematics, the more uncertain and speculative the conclusion we draw therefrom. Whenever calculus is brought in, or higher algebra, you could take it as a warning signal that the operator was trying to substitute theory for experience. This sounded ridiculous to the 80 MBAs and 15 PhD in the training class. What was the point of owning a bazooka if the law made you hunt with a bow and arrow? The equity department seemed desperately backward. It was aware its pitch was badly off-key, so it stopped singing one day and arranged for one of its bright young men to speak to us. It was its shining new toy. It was his job to dazzle us with his brilliance, blind us with his science. He worked in the newest and hottest area in the department, program trading. He lectured on his specialty. Then he opened the floor to questions. An MBA from Chicago named Frankie Simon moved in for the kill. When you trade equity options, asked my friend Frankie, do you hedge your gamma and theta or just your delta? And if you don't hedge your gamma and theta, why not? The equity options specialist nodded for about 10 seconds. I'm not sure he even understood the words. We trainees were equally oblivious, but we felt that any self-respecting options trader should avoid being stumped by a trainee. The options trader lamely tried to laugh himself out of his hole. You know, he said, I don't know the answer. That's probably why I don't have trouble trading. I'll find out and come back tomorrow. I'm not really up on options theory. That, said Frankie, is why you are in equities. That faced him completely. The young would-be stud from equities had no response. He just curled up in a little ball and writhed in pain. How humiliating, faced by a trainee. Eventually, it became uncool to be seen in the equity department. Imagine our horror then when the equity department began a trainee outreach program. Birani insisted on dining with each of us, and all of a sudden, we all were candidates for equities in Dallas. People panicked. Many tried to make themselves deeply undesirable. A few were experts in the field. Still, they could run, but they could no longer hide. No one was safe. Rumors spread of a short list being created by the equity department of trainees in whom it was interested. Then we received a crushing piece of news. The equity department was planning a boat trip to become further acquainted with the trainees on its short list. Could it be true? It was. 6 trainees had been targeted by Biryani, though which 6 my source did not know. And that became clear when the invitations arrived. 4 of the 6 went to back row people. So there was rough justice in the world. One went to Myron Samuels, who could afford to laugh about it because the municipal bond department had already promised to save him. The 6th came to me. I was as helpless as the female victim of an arranged marriage who, upon first seeing the horrible visage of her chosen mate, shrieks in vain. I had only so much say in my future at Salomon Brothers. My influence could be only weak and indirect, using managing directors as my mouthpiece. The way out of this developing snare was to play frigid with the equity department and, at the same time, encouraging a managing director from another department to pursue me. The risk was that I would offend the equity department, which would then try to have me fired. True, it didn't have a great deal of power, but firing me did not require a great deal of power. The boat floated off the southern tip of Manhattan. The men from equities tried to corner us and rhapsodize about this market. The trainees danced and weaved like boxers. 3 minutes in the front of the boat, then to the back of the boat, then to the engine room. Around and round we went, and the boat seemed to get smaller and smaller. An hour into the cruise, and the boat seemed like a dinghy. Soon someone would begin to recite memoirs of a trader as the sea washed against the side of a cycle-line cruiser. Their mating ritual was brutally straightforward. Once they had cornered you on a boat, they poured a few whiskeys into you, waited until the moon rose over the canyons of Wall Street, and positioned the circle line in view of the stock exchange. Then a managing director put his arm around you and told you that you were an especially talented trainee, and wouldn't you like to put that talent to work in a sure-to-be successful career in equities? Think of history. Think of the culture. I thought instead of a good rule of survival on Wall Street, never agree to anything proposed on someone else's boat, or you regret it in the morning. I was extraordinarily agile and found a way to avoid trouble. Myron Samuels described the morning following the boat ride as a coyote morning. After an ill-considered one-night stand, you wake up to see for the first time the face of the woman you've slept with. Your arm is pinned to the bed by her head, and rather than wake her, like an entrapped coyote, you chewed off your arm and scrambled. By the cruel light of the morning, the equity department indeed appeared once again to be pimply and gross. Still, the hunters pursued. We were invited to play in a softball game between the Salomon Equity Department and one of his largest clients. The managing director, who the night before had whispered soothing words into my ear, now didn't even remember my name. He was too busy falling over himself to please his customers to worry about anything else. It was apparent that we, the team from Salomon, were not supposed to win. Also, we were to laugh whenever the other team made a joke, however awful. I muffed a few grounders at shortstop for the cause and chuckled like a fool. Such humorous fellows were our customers, but knew I had done the right thing the night before by locking myself in the bathroom. As the training program neared its conclusion, the backroom game of liar's poker grew. Bond trading had captured the imaginations of more than half the men in the class. Instead of saying buy and sell like normal human beings, they said bid and offer. All aspiring traders were making markets in anything that could be quantified. From the number of points the Giants would score to the number of minutes before the first of the Japanese fell asleep to the number of words on the back page of the New York Post. At the front of the classroom each morning, a young hopeful shouted, "I'll bid a quarter for your bagel." Bonds, bonds, and more bonds. Anyone who did not want to trade them for a living wanted to sell them. This group now included several women who had initially hoped to trade. At Salomon Brothers, men traded, women sold. No one ever questioned the Salomon ordering of the sexes. But the immediate consequence of the prohibition of women in trading was clear to all. It kept women farther from power. A trader placed bets in the markets on behalf of Salomon Brothers. A salesman was the trader's mouthpiece to most of the outside world. The salesman spoke with institutional investors such as pension funds, insurance companies, and savings and loans. The minimum skills required for the two jobs were quite different. Traders required market savvy. Salesmen required interpersonal skills. But the very best traders were also superb salesmen, for they had to persuade the salesman to persuade his customers to buy bond X or sell bond Y. And the very best salesmen were superb traders and found customers virtually giving their portfolios over to them to manage. The difference between a trader and a salesman was more than a matter or mere function. The traders ruled the shop, and it wasn't hard to see why. A salesman's year-end bonus was determined by traders. A trader's bonus was determined by the profits on his trading books. A salesman had no purchase on a trader, while a trader had complete control over a salesman. Not surprisingly, young salesmen dashed around the place looking cowed and frightened, while young traders smoked cigars. That the tyranny of the trader was institutionalized shouldn't surprise anyone. Traders were the people closest to the money. The firm's top executives were traders. Goodfriend himself had been a trader. There were even occasional rumors, probably started by the traders, that all the salespeople were going to be fired, and the firm would simply trade in a blissful vacuum. Who needed the customers anyway? Good bond traders had fast brains and enormous stamina. They watched the markets 12 and sometimes 16 hours a day, and not just the market in bonds. They watched dozens of financial and commodity markets, stocks, oil, natural gas, currencies, and anything else that might in some way influence the bond market. They sat down in their chairs at 7 a.m. and stayed put until dark. Few of them cared to talk about their jobs. They were as reticent as veterans of an unpopular war. They valued profits and money, especially money, and all the things that money could buy, and all the kudos that attached to the person with the most of it. As I had arrived at the firm with no concrete plans for my future, I was willing to consider almost anything. Nevertheless, I quickly came to the conclusion that I could never be a bond trader from having met a great number of them and not finding one who bore the slightest resemblance to me. We had, as far as I could tell, nothing in common. I thought as serious of being a trader as I thought of being Chinese. That made me, by default, a salesman. I found imagining myself as a bond salesman only marginally more plausible than imagining myself as a bond trader. I was experiencing the same clumsiness making the transition from school to work inside Salomon as I had outside Salomon. And much to my distress, the whole idea of working on a trading floor, rather than growing familiar, became more daunting as the training program progressed. The bond salesmen from the 41st floor who spoke to us were by definition leaders in the firm, and they might have provided me with a role model, but their smooth metal services offered nothing to cling to. They expressed no interest outside selling bonds, and they rarely referred to any life outside Salomon Brothers. Their lives seemed to begin and end on the 41st floor, and I began to wonder if I weren't about to enter the twilight zone. More different types of people succeeded on the trading floor than I initially supposed. Some of the men who spoke to us were truly awful human beings. They sacked others to promote themselves. They harassed women. They humiliated trainees. They didn't have customers. They had victims. Others were naturally extremely admirable characters. They inspired those around them. They treated their customers almost fairly. They were kind to the trainees. The point is not that a big swinging was intrinsically evil. The point is that it didn't matter one bit whether he was good or evil as long as he continued to swing the big bat of his. Bad guys did not suffer their comeuppance in Act 5 on the 31st floor. They flourished. Goodness was not taken into account on the trading floor. It was neither rewarded nor punished. It just was, or it wasn't. Because the 41st floor was the chosen home of the firm's most ambitious people, and because there were no rules governing the pursuit of profit and glory, the men who worked there, including the more bloodthirsty, had a haunted look about them. The place was governed by the simple understanding that unbridled pursuit of perceived self-interest was healthy. Eat or be eaten. The men of 41st worked with one eye cast over their shoulders to see whether someone was trying to do them in. For there was no telling what manner of man had levered himself to the rung below you and was now hungry for your job. The range of acceptable conduct within Salomon Brothers were wide indeed. It said something about the ability of the free marketplace to mold people's behavior into a socially acceptable pattern, for this was capitalism at its most raw, and it was self-destructive. As a Salomon Brothers trainee, of course, you didn't worry too much about ethics. You were just trying to stay alive. You felt flattered to be on the same team with the people who kicked everyone's all the time. Like a kid mysteriously befriended by the schoolyard bully, you tended to overlook the flaws of bond people in exchange for the protection. I sat wide-eyed when these people came to speak to us and observed a behavioral smorgasbord, the likes of which I had never before encountered, except in fiction. As a student, you had to start from the premise that each of these characters were immensely successful, then try to figure out why. And so it was, in this frame of mind, that I first watched the human piranha in action. The human piranha came to tell us about government bonds, though he was so knowledgeable about the handling of money that he could have spoken about whatever he wished. He was the only bond salesman who made traders nervous, because he generally knew their job better than they did. And if they screwed up by giving him a wrong price, he usually made a point by humiliating them on the hoot and holler. It gave other salespeople great satisfaction to watch him do this. The human piranha was short and square, like the hooker on a rugby team. The most unusual thing about him was the frozen expression on his face. His dark eyes, black holes really, rarely moved, and when they did, they moved very slowly, like a periscope. His mouth never seemed to alter in shape, rather expanded and contracted proportionally when he spoke. And out of that mouth came a steady stream of bottom-line analysis and profanity. The piranha, that day, began by devouring the government of France. The French government had issued a bond known as Giscard. The piranha was troubled by the Giscard, so duped because it had been the brainchild of the government of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. The French had raised about $1 billion in 1978 with the bond. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that the bond was, under certain conditions, exchangeable into gold at $32 an ounce, i.e., the holder of, say, $32 million of the bonds, rather than accept cash, could demand 1 million ounces of gold. The frogs are getting their faces ripped off, said the piranha, meaning that the French were losing a lot of money on the bond issue now that the bond had indeed become convertible and the price of gold was $500 an ounce. The stupidity of the frogs disgusted the piranha. He associated it with the habit of quitting work at 5 p.m. The European work ethic was his bête noire, though he put it differently. He had once derided a simpering group of Salomon's Englishmen and continental Europeans who had complained of being overworked by calling them Euro. Once he'd finished with France, he whipped out charts to show the way a government bond arbitrage trade worked. As he spoke, the people in the front row grew nervous, and the people in the back row began to giggle, and the people in the front row grew more nervous still, fearing that the people in the back row would cause the piranha to feed on us all. The piranha didn't talk like a person. He said things like, if you buy this bond in a trade, you're And if you don't pay attention to the 2 year, you get your face ripped off. Noun, verb, adjective. No part of speech was spared. His world was filled with copulating inanimate objects and people getting their faces ripped off. We had never before heard of people getting their faces ripped off, and he said it so often, like a nervous tick, that each time he said it again, the back row giggled. The human piranha, a Harvard graduate, thought nothing of it. He was always like this. Dozens of salesmen and traders from each of the 3 bond groups passed through our program. I recall only a few. The human piranha came from governments and was typically not so much of the department as of the entire movement on the Salomon trading floor. A man from corporates came at verbal expression from a more novel angle. This man took a different, more thoroughly intimidating approach to us. The human piranha had rattled the front row people, but to the back row people, he was just weird. The man from corporates rattled everyone. He arrived early one morning unannounced, about 9 weeks into the program. His name was, well, let's call him Sang-Froid, for the ice water that coursed through his veins. A mild English accent heightened the chill that shot through the air when he spoke. He was sufficiently tall to see out over the entire classroom, which was 12 seats across and extended back perhaps 15 rows. An aisle of steps ran through the room, front to back. For a minute after he arrived, he said nothing. A minute seems longer when it belongs exclusively to a tall, chilly man in a grey suit staring at 127 wired trainees. Sang-Froid then walked up the aisle. At times like this, the back row inclined to craven panic. You could hear them whispering, "Why is he coming back here? He can't do that. What is he doing?" But he stopped before he reached the back. He picked up someone sitting on the edge of his seat in the middle of the room and asked, "What is your name?" "Ron Rosenberg," said the trainee. Well, Ron, said Seinfeld, what is LIBOR today? LIBOR? LIBOR? A dozen back row people whispered to the person next to them, what the is LIBOR? LIBOR is an acronym for London Interbank Offered Rate. It is the interest rate in London at which one bank lends to another, and it is available at 8 a.m. London time or 3 a.m. New York time. That gave the trainee 4 whole hours to find out the LIBOR rate before class began at 7 a.m. Along with every other fact in the bond markets, Seinfeld expected us to have LIBOR on the tips of our tongues. This morning, said Ron, LIBOR is 7.25%, which puts it up 25 basis points from yesterday. Amazing. Seinfeld had called on the one person in the class who actually knew the LIBOR rate. At least half the class couldn't have told you that LIBOR meant, much less where it had traded that day. Nevertheless, Seinfeld took the answer in stride. He did not even congratulate Rosenberg. He resumed his stroll toward the back of the class, and the tension rose with each step. You, he said to the back row person, what is your name? Bill Lewis, said the trainee. Bill, where is the TED spread this morning? Seinfeld said, turning up the heat. The TED spread was the difference between the LIBOR rate and the interest rate on 3-month U.S. Treasury bills. The bill rate became available only a half hour before class started. It didn't matter. Lewis hadn't a clue to anything. With Lewis, ignorance was a matter of principle. He reddened, bit his lip, and looked defiantly at Seinfeld. I don't know. Why not? Shot back Seinfeld. I didn't look at it this morning, said Lewis. Contact. This is exactly what Seinfeld had ventured into the back of the room to find. Ignorance, sloth, lack of commitment to the cause. This was unacceptable, he told us. A Salomon trainee had to be current and competent, as Goodfriend liked to say. No wonder a very poor impression of us was being formed on the trading floor, and so on. And then he left. But before he did, he let us know that he would be stopping in from time to time. Seinfeld and the human piranha turned out to be 2 of my favorite people on the 41st floor. There was no about them. They were brutal, but they were also honest and I think fair. The problems on 41st were caused by people who were tough but unfair, otherwise known, under the breath of many a trainee, as flaming You survived the human piranha and Sir Seinfeld by simply knowing what you were about. How, though, did you survive a trader who threw a phone at your head every other time you passed his desk? How did a woman cope with a married managing director who tried to seduce her whenever he found her alone? The training program wasn't a survival course, but sometimes a person came through who put the horrors of 41st into perspective. For me, it was a young bond salesman, just a year out of the training program and at work on 41st, named Richard O'Grady. When O'Grady entered the classroom, the first thing he did was to have the video that usually recorded events shut off. Then he closed the door. Then he checked for eavesdroppers on the ledges outside the 23rd floor windows. Only then did he sit down. He began by telling us how he had come to Salomon. He had been one of the firm's lawyers. The firm's lawyers, when they saw how good traders had it, often ended up as traders themselves. The firm had actually invited O'Grady to apply. He interviewed on a Friday afternoon. His first meeting was with a managing director named Lee Kimmel. When O'Grady walked into Kimmel's office, Kimmel was reading his resume. He looked up from the resume and said, Amherst Phi Beta Kappa, star athlete, Harvard Law School. You must get laid a lot. O'Grady laughed. What's so funny? Asked Kimmel. The thought that I get laid a lot, said O'Grady. That's not funny, said Kimmel, a viciousness coming into his voice. How much do you get laid? That's none of your business, said O'Grady. Kimmel slammed his fist on the desk. Don't give me that If I want to know, you tell me, understand? Somehow O'Grady squirmed through his interview and others, until at the end of the day, he found himself facing the same man who had given me my job, Leo Corbett. So, Dick, said Corbett, what would you say if I offered you a job? Well, said O'Grady, I'd like to work at Salomon, but I'd also like to go home and think it over for a day or two. You sound more like a lawyer than a trader, said Corbett. Leo, I'm not making a trade. I'm making an investment, said O'Grady. I don't want to hear any of that Harvard Law School clever, said Corbett. I'm beginning to think you would be a real mistake. I'm going to walk out of here and come back in 10 minutes, and when I come back, I want an answer. O'Grady's first reaction, he said, was that he had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. Then he thought about it like a human being. Salomon had invited him to interview. Where did these get off issuing ultimatums? O'Grady worked himself into an Irish rage. Corbett was gone far longer than he promised, making O'Grady even angrier. Well, said Corbett upon his return. Well, I wouldn't work here for all the money in the world, said O'Grady. I've never met more in my entire life. Take your job and stick it. Now I'm finally beginning to hear something I like, said Corbett. That's the first smart thing you've said all day. O'Grady stormed out of Salomon Brothers and took a job with another Wall Street firm. But that was only the beginning of the story. The story, O'Grady said, resumed a year after he had told Leo Corbett where to stick his job offer. Salomon had called him again. It had apologized for the way it had behaved. It had been smart to do so because O'Grady became not only an excellent bond salesman, but also a rare and much-needed example of goodness on the trading floor. The surprise was not that Salomon called him, but that O'Grady had agreed to listen. The only thing history teaches us, a wise man once said, is that history doesn't teach us anything. O'Grady took a job with Salomon Brothers. And now he was about to tell us what we wanted to know. So you want to know how to deal with these, don't you? He said. Trainees sort of nodded their heads. O'Grady said he had discovered the secret earlier than most. When he was just starting out, he said, he had an experience that taught him a lesson. He had been a flunky for a senior bond salesman named Penn King, a tall, blonde, big, swinging if ever there was one. One day, King told him to find prices on 4 bonds for a very large customer, Morgan Guarantee. O'Grady therefore asked the relevant trader for prices. When the trader saw him, however, he said, "What the do you want?" "Just a few prices," said O'Grady. "I'm busy," said the trader. "Oh well," thought O'Grady, "I'll see if I can find the prices on the Quotron machine." As O'Grady fiddled with the keyboard of the Quotron, it resembles a personal computer. Penn King demanded the prices for his customer. "I told you to get the prices, goddammit," he said. So O'Grady walked back to ask the trader again. Said the trader. "Here, read it off the sheets," and handed O'Grady a sheet listing bond prices. O'Grady returned to his desk only to find that while there were plenty of prices on the sheet, there weren't the prices he needed. "Where are the prices?" asked Penn. O'Grady explained what had transpired between himself and the trader to that point. "Then this is what you do. You hear me," said a completely pissed off Penn King. "You go over to that and you say, 'Look, since you were so helpful the first time I asked, maybe you could give me the prices for Morgan Guarantee.'" So O'Grady went back to the trader. He figured he could edit the request, take out the part about the and being helpful. He had his sanitized version in his mind. "Look, I'm really sorry to be such a pain in the neck," he was planning to say, "but Morgan Guarantee is one of our biggest customers, and we need your help." But when he reached the trader rose to his feet and screamed, "What the are you doing here? I told you, I am busy." "Look, said O'Grady, forgetting the sanitized version, "since you were so helpful the first time I asked, maybe you would be so kind to give me the price now." The trader fell back in his chair. O'Grady was, conveniently, about twice the size of a trader. He stood over the trader and stared for about a minute. He shouted again, for effect. All of a sudden, the trader looked spooked. "Penn," he half screamed, half whined across the floor to O'Grady's boss. "What is it with this guy?" Gave an innocent little shrug, as if to say he didn't have the faintest idea. O'Grady walked back to his seat, to a standing ovation from 3 or 4 other bond salesmen who had watched the scene develop, and a big grin from Penn. Sure enough, not 2 minutes later, the trader came to him with the prices. "And after that," said O'Grady to a spellbound training program, "he didn't with me again." As you might imagine, this threw the back row into frenzied delight. It had them stomping on the floor like beach bums after a grand slam. It drove a lump into the throats of the front row. O'Grady was by training and disposition a refined and relaxed man. True, he had a rogue streak of Irish in him, but if anyone was going to sidestep the Neanderthal approach to life on 41st, it would have been O'Grady. What was the moral of the story? Easy. There was no getting around having to knock someone down to win a seat on 41st, even if you graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Amherst and Harvard Law School, were a star athlete, and got laid a lot. What was the secret to dealing with the lift weights or learn karate? Said O'Grady.
As if to confirm this impression, following on the heels of O'Grady came the mortgage trading department. With the possible exception of John Merriweather, the mortgage traders were the firm's biggest swinging The mortgage department was the most profitable area of the firm, and the place trainees most desperately wanted to work. It could afford to be nasty. It concluded the classroom stage of our training. The mortgage trading desks on 41st were between the elevators and a corner in which I had chosen to hide. I had selected my corner with care. It housed a friendly managing director and his small team of mostly non-violent persons. This manager director had, in effect, promised to save me from equities in Dallas. He also gave me temporary shelter. Each day, as I leaped off the elevator onto 41st and sprinted head down for the cover of my MD, I had to decide whether to walk through the mortgage trading desks. And each day I decided I had better not. The mortgage traders emitted such evil vibes that I carved a wide loop around them every afternoon. Even then, I felt uneasy. They were known for hurling phones at the heads of trainees and were said to have installed extra long cords to increase their range. I later found out that they were just as likely to use the phone bombs on seasoned professionals, and that people who had been with Salomon Brothers for years and had weathered every kind of abuse still refused to walk through the mortgage department. Every firm on Wall Street had its baddest dudes, and these were ours. In spite of my craven panic in the presence of mortgage traders, I was curious about their business and their boss, Louis Ranieri. All Salomon trainees were curious about Ranieri. Louis Ranieri was the wild and woolly genius, the Salomon legend who began in the mailroom, worked his way onto the trading floor, and created a market in America for mortgage bonds. Ranieri was Salomon, and Salomon was Ranieri. He was constantly being held out as an example of all that was special about our firm. He was evidence that the trading floor was a meritocracy. At Salomon Brothers, because of what Ranieri had achieved, a great deal seemed possible that otherwise might have not. I had never seen the great man myself, but I had read about him. We had been told he would speak to us. He didn't show. Instead, he sent 3 senior mortgage traders to represent his department. The 3 of them together could have easily weighed 900 pounds. They stood together at the front of the room in formation, the one in the middle smoking the biggest cigar I've ever seen, cheap but large. He's the one I remember. He didn't say anything, just grunted and laughed when a trainee asked a question. Dozens of trainees wanted to trade mortgage bonds, so they asked plenty of questions, but they got no answers. When once a trainee asked something stupid, the man with the cigar gave the only response in English I recall. He said, "So, you want to be a mortgage trader?" Then all 3 of the traders laughed together and sounded like a fleet of tugboats blowing their horns. The sad student had wanted to be a mortgage trader. So had 35 others. In the end, 5 were chosen. I was not, which was fine by me. I was shipped to London to become a bond salesman. In due course, I shall return to my private education on the London trading floor. But here it is time to follow the story of the mortgage traders. For not only were they the soul of the firm, they were the microcosm of Wall Street in the 1980s. The mortgage market was one of 2 or 3 textbook cases that illustrated the change sweeping the world of finance. I followed our mortgage traders closely from my seat in London, mostly because I was intrigued that such awful-looking people could do so well for themselves. I was fascinated by Ranieri. For several years running, he and his traders made more money than anyone on Wall Street. I didn't like them one bit, but that was probably a point in their favor. Their presence was a sign of the health of the firm, just as mine was a sign of the illness. If the mortgage traders left Salomon, I figured we'd had it. There would be nothing remaining but a bunch of nice guys.